Okay, welcome back to class. Last week we were discussing some of the evidences that required explanations according to how and why these mammoths ended up in the situations that they did, the conditions that they did. And so we ended up last week, the last thing we had covered was the evidence of a summer or fall death. So we're going to move on now to the next mystery that needs to be explained, and that is that several of the mammoths, even mammoth skeletons, were found in unexpectedly upright positions. So despite this posture, Bereshkova mammoth that we talked about earlier had a broken pelvis and a shoulder blade and a crushed leg. And surprisingly, he was not lying on his side in a position of agony, as you would expect. If you had a broken leg, you would have fallen over. So as we stated earlier, generally when an animal dies, it loses control and generally will end up in somewhat of a resting or lying position. It would not fall into this type of position, where it would be preserved in an upright position. That would be quite unusual. So this is, again, another seemingly unanswered mystery here. And finally, also, some mammoths have also been found exhibiting evidences of being severely vertically compressed. So we discussed earlier that Bereshkova's crushed leg bone earlier supports the thought of being vertically compressed while being held firmly in place. In other words, something was holding its leg in place while it was vertically compressed. Otherwise, it wouldn't have broken into the many pieces that it did. Other finds of mammoths have similar evidences of being vertically compressed as well. So we showed earlier too the remains of a baby mammoth named Dima. And that showed evidences of being vertically compressed. So recall that his flattened but well-preserved body was encased in a lens of ice. So others have been found with similar evidences of extreme vertical compression, indicating that there must have been a large amount of weight compressing them from above. So these are the mysterious features that require explanations. Now we want to shift now to look at the different theories that Dr. Brown goes through in the book, or lists in the book. There's 10 of them total, including the hydroplate theory. So we're just going to kind of briefly go through some of them, although some of them will require a little more time than others. Some will bring up some subjects that I think we'll want to spend a little bit of time on. But we're going to start with what's called the lake drowning theory. So the lake drowning theory is the first one that he has in his chart. And this one proposes that the mammoths were drowned in partially frozen lakes, rivers, or bogs. So this theory proposes that these drownings occurred independently of each other, and therefore were not really the result of a single catastrophe. In other words, the Great Flood was not the cause of the frozen mammoths, per this theory. So the well-preserved mammoths died suddenly with food in their stomachs and also between their teeth, probably from asphyxiation resulting from drowning, according to this theory. And this theory proposes that such burials can preserve tissue, or animal tissue, and even human tissue for thousands of years. So to make Dr. Brown's chart comparing these different theories and how well they describe each of the evidences, I have tried to make this easier to view here. So I put the chart back up here, and I've covered up all the other theories and highlighted just the one we're specifically talking about here. Just hopefully make it easier to see, because the chart by itself is a little intimidating looking if you see the whole thing. And of course, using the analogy of the stoplight, with the key here of the green meaning that it explains the evidence. Yellow means that it has moderate problems and doesn't necessarily explain the evidence being considered. And then, of course, red indicates there's serious problems with this item, this particular evidence. So using this key here for the lake drowning theory, we'll see that the theory does explain about 5 of the evidences of the total of the 19 categories on the chart, but has moderate problems, which are the ones shown in yellow here, with at least 6 of the evidences, and it has serious problems with 7 others. Again, those are the ones shown in red. So the things that it fails to explain are the abundant food or warm climate that these animals appear to have needed, to live, as the theory states. If they were partially drowned in a frozen lake, that's contrary to a warm climate that would be needed to be present for the abundant amount of food and type of food found in the stomachs and mouths of these animals. If the lake they drown in was partially frozen, this also does not explain how they would have been very suddenly frozen to prevent digestion of the stomach contents quickly enough to preserve it before they started to break down because of the enzymes and digestion in their stomachs. And also, like all the other theories, other than hydroplate theory, the lake drowning theory does not address or explain the extremely low temperatures needed to flash freeze them, or it doesn't also explain the peppered or bombarded tusks. So this also theory proposes there was no single catastrophe responsible for the frozen mammoths. Therefore, their freezings would have been numerous, unrelated, independent events. This seems highly unlikely since so many of these animals have been found frozen in very similar circumstances over extensive areas, which highly suggests a common cause. So there's so many problems with this theory, I think it appears to be quite unlikely. The next theory in line is called the crevasse theory. And this theory assumes that some mammoths fell into ice crevices or deep snow drifts where they became frozen. And this protected them from predators, while ice preserved them for thousands of years. And a man named Charles Lyell, who was the most influential founder of the modern geology theories today, and who's also frequently called the father of modern geology, advocated this particular theory to explain these frozen mammoths. However, crevasse theory fails to explain a number of evidences also, like the abundant food, the warm climate needed, the dirty lungs, the peppered tusks, temperatures below 150 degrees, below zero necessary. Again, this is an evidence that all the other theories fail to explain except for hydroplate theory. And we'll get to that when we describe hydroplate theory. And other problems too. It has moderate problems also explaining 9 other evidences. And so it doesn't really sound like this one holds up very well either. Next one is the mud burial theory, which proposes that in Siberian summers, the top foot or so of the tundra would have thawed so that larger animals could easily become stuck in this mud standing upright. So herds of mammoths and rhinoceros and buffalo made summer migrations to northern Siberia and Alaska, according to this theory. Some of them became stuck in this mud, and others were overwhelmed and suffocated in mudslides. Still others died for various reasons, and they were buried in slow mud flows during several summer thaws, and then sudden cold spells, sometimes followed by long cold winters, then froze and preserved many mammoths. Again, this is how what this theory advocates. So it seems to me here too there's a lot of obvious problems with this theory. So the mud burial theory does not explain 5 of the evidences at all, and serious problems with 6 more, and moderate problems with 8 more. The serious problems include the accounting for the sudden freezing and temperatures of 150 degrees below zero or lower to freeze them, of course, fast enough to stop decay of their stomach contents. And then also, this is something that would have to have taken place only a few hours or within a few hours of having eaten the food that they ate. Remember, we talked about having to flash freeze these animals very quickly in order for that to occur. Also, if these animals became stuck in a few feet of mud on the top of the unfrozen tundra in the summer, how could they stay in place for any reasonable amount of time without being completely buried, without first dying, and then, of course, as they die, they would start decomposing. Or possibly scavengers or predators would start to eat them. If others were rapidly buried in mudslides along with buried mud, this actually would have been a relatively good insulator from the cold temperatures following a rapid decay, allowing a fairly rapid decay of their stomach contents. So this theory also doesn't address the peppered trunks, the presence of rock ice, or mixes of animals found frequently near the mammoths. So many similar circumstances over such a large geographic area again suggests a common cause that the mud burial theory fails to explain. For these and other reasons, I think we can dismiss this theory as having a rational explanation for the frozen mammoths. Another one is called the river transport theory. And this theory states that the mammoths and other animals lived farther south in the temperate zones of Asia where food was abundant. Flooding rivers drowned many of them and then carried them or floated their remains from central Siberia on the north flowing rivers. Since the flooding rivers carried mammoth carcasses from temperate zones to the cold north remains, many of them would have become frozen in the much colder environment. So the river transport theory suffers from a number of issues also, as well as including not explaining why frozen mammoths are also found far from rivers. If rivers transported them to where they ended up, you would expect them to actually be buried nearby rivers, but not far from them. Also, if transported by rivers, this would take some time in order for them to be carried to their final places by the rivers. And over that amount of time, there should have been signs of decomposition of their remains. So if they were drowned, they would have started to decompose as they were carried along in the rivers. However, that's not the case, as the remains, when unfrozen, appear to be quite fresh and not rotten or putrid. Another major issue is why drowning would embed particles rich in iron and nickel on one sides of their tusks, as noted in many of the mammoth finds. Again, all the other theories, like this one, can't explain the sudden drop of temperature to minus 150 degrees or more needed to quick freeze the animal. Remember we talked earlier, the coldest that it's ever been on Earth recorded is about 128 degrees below zero in Antarctica. So nothing, and we'll have an explanation for this as we go on, but nothing seems to explain, and that's why none of these other theories can explain this rapid temperature drop, significantly below the lowest temperatures ever been recorded on Earth. And of course, flowing rivers would have been significantly higher in temperature than 150 degrees below zero. I don't know of any river that would flow at minus 150 degrees below zero temperatures. And being carried by rivers does not explain vertical compression or being found upright or being found in rock ice. And so I think this is another theory that just bites the dust. The next one in line is called the extinction by man theory, and it says that man exterminated mammoths, just as man almost exterminated the buffalo. So this theory says or states that man, in hunting mammoths, pursued and pushed them north into Siberia and into Alaska. There they died from the harsh weather, or lack of food, or by direct killing of man, or by man. And of course, problems and even more problems. There is little precedent for believing that man would push any animal population into a harsh environment having little food. Most frozen mammoths were complete enough to evaluate that they were very well fed. Even if man pushed these animals north into Siberia and Alaska, why would a disproportionate number of them be buried on the higher elevations of generally flat plateaus? However, animals fleeing rising floodwaters could explain this. They would want to go to higher ground, right? They would try to escape to higher ground to escape the rising floodwaters. So that makes sense. And again, there's no explanation for them being buried in muck, having their peppered tusks, having dirty lungs, being found upright, or being found vertically compressed. So being hunted by man would not explain these factors, or explain the findings of silt and clay and small gravel particles in the respiratory and digestive tracts that have been found in some of the mammoth remains. Again, the peppered tusk is another problem too. So this one has so many problems. I think this one's going to have to step out of line too. Next up is the Bering barrier theory. So according to this theory, an ice age, or the ice age, caused more ice to form on the continents, and more ice on the continents would have lowered the ocean levels And they propose in this that the ocean levels would have lowered by around 300 feet. And as we will discuss, an ice age can be explained by large amounts of evaporation resulting from warm oceans causing high levels of snowfall on the higher and cooler continents. But the lower ocean levels, according to this theory, would have lowered the oceans by around 300 feet. And so the bridge, this would have created a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, as shown here on the map. So the Bering Strait's shown in the red circle here. And if you could imagine that the water levels drop 300 feet, there would have been a land bridge between Alaska and Russia. So the Bering Strait is currently 53 miles wide. And of course, it's a waterway separating northeasternmost Russia from the northwesternmost area of Alaska. So the average depth of the ocean in the Bering Strait is between 98 and 164 feet. So if the ocean levels drop by some 300 feet, the ocean floor, of course, would become a land bridge. It would be exposed and essentially create a solid piece of land between the two currently separated. So this land bridge would also have separated the warmer Pacific Ocean south or below the land bridge from the cold Arctic oceans above or north of the land bridge between the continents. So if the levels dropped by 300 feet, the ocean floor would have been exposed and again would have become a connecting bridge here. And of course, lowering the sea levels would have created this bridge, allowing people and animals, including mammoths, to migrate between Siberia and Alaska, and also onto now what are the islands up in the Arctic Ocean. They could have now been migrated to as well. So this might explain how these animals ended up being on some of those islands. Because the warmer Pacific waters could no longer mix with the through the Bering Strait with the colder Arctic oceans, the Pacific waters became even warmer and the Arctic waters became even colder. Again, this is according to this theory. And this would have resulted in heavy evaporation from the Pacific, and this would have caused extremely high snow levels on higher and colder land masses, especially north of the Bering Barrier. So this theory proposes that mammoths and others were buried in severe ice storms early one fall. As the ice age ended, heavy rains washed the soil down on top of the compacted snow deposits, forming rock ice. I guess that wouldn't cause rock ice, but this is what the theory is proposing. Some of the frozen mammoths and rock ice are still preserved, and since then glacial melting has raised the sea levels back to reestablish the Bering Strait. So no longer is there a land bridge between Alaska and Russia. So the problem with this theory is that it places the mammoth's extinction at the peak of the last ice age, where northern Siberia and Alaska had a colder climate and therefore would have had even less vegetation. So during the dark winter months, food and drinking water would not have been available inside the Arctic Circle, and yet mammoths were well fed. And they also must have adequate water, or they couldn't have survived. So they can't drink frozen water. They don't, and the energy it would take to thaw frozen water would have just been tremendous. This theory also does not address the mammoths being encased in the frozen muck, being vertically compressed, the pepper tusks, and of course, as all the other ones don't explain, the 150 degree below zero or colder temperatures that would have been needed to freeze them fast enough. So their stomach contents have been preserved. And there's other problems with this one as well, but I think again, this is another reason why this one is going to drop out. The next in line is the mild ice age theory. Now this theory is one worth spending a little time on because of the name of the theory, in that it contains the thought that the burial of these animals was caused by an ice age. So this brings up another number of questions, such as what is an ice age? How many ice ages have there been? When were they, and what circumstances are necessary to actually produce an ice age, and what circumstances are necessary to actually stop an ice age? So a lot of questions here. So I think therefore this warrants a discussion of what an ice age is and what could have caused an ice age or ice ages. This is something I did want to cover in the class at some point, so I think this seems to be a good place to put that into our discussion. But first, what I want to do is explain what this theory is, and then we'll go into explanations of ice ages. This theory was developed by a man named Michael Ord. Now, Michael Ord is a creationist. He's also a meteorologist who argues that a single rapid ice age occurred fairly recently, that is, within several thousand years ago, of course, not millions. He's a creationist, so he's a young Earth creationist, so he's going to be an advocate of a young Earth, thousands of years old, not millions or billions. And this is triggered by the aftermath of the Genesis flood. So a meteorologist, he's a meteorologist, is a scientist who studies Earth's atmosphere and the weather patterns in the atmosphere. And to this, in the notes in the beginning book from Dr. Brown, he states in the notes section regarding this theory, he says, to the best of my knowledge, Michael Ord was the first to publish a proposal that warm waters coming from under the Earth's crust during the flood contributed to the only ice age. And he says, for this, he deserves full credit. We'll see that this is kind of a similar idea to hydroplate theory, although there's some key differences here, which we'll go into. So as we'll soon see, warm oceans are one of the conditions that we believe are necessary to produce an ice age. Walt goes on then to write in his notes in the book, he says that in 1972, after reading a book by Dolph Hooker titled Those Astounding Ice Ages, he says, I reached a similar conclusion, that warm waters in the oceans were necessary for an ice age to occur. And he also said that since 1972, every one of his several hundred lectures that he conducted on the flood explained how the flood produced the ice age, or more precisely, an ice age each winter for many years after the flood. And we're going to see shortly the reasons why that is. But Ord's theory, look a little deeper into his theory here. It says it proposes that the pre-flood subterranean waters, the waters underneath the crust, were about 3,000 to 10,000 feet below the Earth's surface. This is a key difference between hydroplate theory and Ord's theory. And hydroplate theory proposes there's about a 60-mile thick crust with water underneath that crust. And we'll discuss that a little later on as well. But according to Ord's theory, during snow and dust storms, about 700 years after the global flood, some mammoths were frozen and buried and suffocated and preserved, a few of them standing up. So here's how Ord proposes this happen. He says the floodwaters were warm, if not hot, because they came from the 3,000 to 10,000 feet below the Earth's crust, and as you go lower, of course, in the Earth, temperatures become hotter, and at 3,000 to 10,000 feet lower, the temperatures were 30 to 100 degrees hotter than the surface temperatures. So the warm post-flood oceans that came from this water under the crust produced both heavy evaporation and thus snowfall. And as snow depths increased, the ice age began, and it lasted about 700 years until the oceans cooled sufficiently to reverse that. During this time, thick ice sheets built up in the continental interiors and lowered the sea levels somewhat. This theory goes on to say, during those 700 years, mammoths migrated from the mountains of Ararat, from where the Ark came to rest, to northern Siberia, and from there to Alaska during the brief exposure of a land bridge across the Bering Strait. So with warm winds off the warm Arctic Ocean producing a tolerable climate for the Ice Age mammoths, their numbers grew to about 10 million. Other temperate animals were also able to live at those high altitudes. Ord goes on to say in his theory, as the oceans cooled, fierce storms would have developed, blowing dust, called lurs. It's spelled L-O-E-S-S, but it's pronounced lurs, would have suffocated and buried most mammoths, some of them standing up. So Lurs is a German word that is basically the same word, or it's describing the same thing as muck does. We talked about muck earlier. Muck is a type of soil that contains tiny plant remains, and it's the type of soil in which many of the mammoths have been buried in. Berescova, for example, what we talked about earlier, was found in this type of soil. So to his credit, Ord actually recognizes most of the problems associated with the frozen mammoths. For example, he states, why would the woolly mammoth, bison, woolly rhinoceros, and horse be attracted to Siberia? So today, of course, Siberia is a barren, blizzard-scourged wilderness. How could the animals have endured the extremely cold winters? What would they eat? This is found in his book called Frozen in Time, published in 2004. And continuing in his book, he says, where would the beasts locate the prodigious quantities of water they require when the land is imprisoned in snow and ice? Even the rivers were covered with several hundred feet of ice every winter. Why would they migrate toward these areas with these conditions? Most puzzling of all is how the mammoths and their companions die en masse, and how would they have become encased in the permafrost? So he goes on with these questions. He understands the questions about the strange circumstances that these animals have been found in. He also states in his book that Bird's Eye Frozen Foods Company ran the calculations and again came up with a staggering 150 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in order to freeze these animals fast enough to preserve them, especially their stomach contents. So how could such temperatures be reached on Earth, especially when they're in a fairly temperate environment before the quick freeze? Again, he understands the problems. Continuing his notes in his book, he notes other strange evidences. He says, one is that the number of carcasses, as well as a few skeletons, have been discovered in a general standing position. And I highlighted this in yellow. This emphasis is actually in his book. So he understands this. And strangely, he goes on to say, scientists investigating 3 woolly mammoths and 2 woolly rhinos, including the Berescova mammoth, found that they all died by suffocation. And again, the emphasis is in his book for the word suffocation there. He knows, he understands these puzzling conditions. And although Ord does recognize and understand these strange circumstances of the frozen mammoth, his theory fails to really explain them. It doesn't seem to explain them at all, actually. So this one has some of the same problems we discussed regarding the Bering Barrier theory we just covered, and that it places mammoth extinction at the peak of the last ice age, where northern Siberia and Alaska would have a cooler climate and, of course, less vegetation. So what did they eat? During the dark winter months, food and drinking water would have not been available inside the Arctic Circle. And yet mammoths were found well-fed, and must have had adequate water supplies, or they couldn't have survived. It doesn't explain the abundant food that would have been necessary either. And also, dust and snowstorms would not have embedded shrapnel in the mammoth tusks. It also does not address the sudden freezing that it would take, these temperatures of 150 degrees or below 0 or lower, to rapidly flash freeze these animals. So Wald also states in his book that Michael Ord and he do agree that the global flood would have produced the Ice Age, in part because warm floodwaters came from inside the Earth. However, Ord overlooks an equally important factor. An Ice Age would also require high and therefore colder continents, something also necessary for an Ice Age to form. So we would have to have higher continents where it's cooler to produce high amounts of snowfall to produce the glaciers and these thick ice sheets. I mean, these ice sheets can be, a mile or more thick. So we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get to the compression event of the hydroplate theory. But the hydroplate theory does explain how mountains could be rapidly risen up higher and would have been therefore colder, and the heat coming from the subterranean waters would have heated the oceans, providing exactly the circumstances necessary to produce very high levels of snowfall and therefore an ice age. But for now, just realize that hydroplate theory provides a very solid scientific explanation as to how this all would have happened. Also, one other thing too is that each of the continents would have been, in most places, elevated probably an additional mile above the surface by thick sediments from the flood, some a mile thick or thicker. So this would have made these continents even higher. So these warm oceans and thus higher and colder continents would have produced high winds, which transported vast amounts of moisture up into the cold continents where heavy amounts of snow and ice accumulated to produce an ice age. In the centuries that passed after the flood, again, this is according to hydroplate theory, the continents began to sink down back into the mantle, and thus their elevation would have lowered. And as they became warmer because of this, this change would actually lead to a gradual end of the ice age. Also, as we just stated, Ord's theory suggests that the pre-flood subterranean water was 3,000 to 10,000 feet below the surface. Can we find this on page 75 of his book? He believes that a deeper source of flood water would have been too hot for present sea life to have survived. There's reasons where that's not really the case, what we'll get into again later on. But realize that 3,000 feet is quite a bit less than a mile. A mile is 5,280 feet, so we're talking quite a bit less than a mile. And he's contending that this is the source of the floodwaters. And of course, if we go to 10,000 feet, that's just under 2 miles. However, water at 3,000 to 10,000 feet depths below the crust would easily and quickly escape to the Earth's surface through the slightest cracks in the crust. What Ord proposes is a totally unsustainable condition. Known principles show that it requires various depths, or depths of at least 5 miles or greater, in order to seal off the Earth's surface so that any cracks or voids in the rocks are totally sealed. This is called the crossover point. But as you get deeper and deeper into the Earth, there's more and more weight from the rock above, and this would compress even the smallest cracks so that they would be actually sealed off. So waters below the 5 miles would be totally impossible for it to reach the surface, and conversely, water at the surface couldn't get down below 5 miles below the crust. So the reason for this is that the pressure of the gravity of the rock above the rock below it, we find that rock becomes strangely somewhat like highly compressed putty, and actually will start to deform and therefore seal off any cracks or voids. We're talking about unbelievable amounts of pressure here. The rock down that below really wouldn't have anywhere to go, so it would start to seal off any cracks, making any cracks totally impossible. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But and Walt has concluded, for various reasons, again we'll talk about in future classes, that he estimates that the subterranean chamber water was about 60 miles below the Earth's pre-flood surface. Part of that is because of the amount of material that was ejected out into outer space to become the asteroids and comets. So it would have taken a good amount of material to be ejected out of the Earth to be able to form those outer space bodies. But at 60 miles below the Earth's surface, of course, this would provide a solid barrier that totally separates the subterranean waters from the surface waters. And that, of course, changes until the beginning of the Great Flood, when a crack appears and the fountains of the Great Deep burst forth. We've discussed that before as well. So in addition to those problems, the mild ice age theory and hydroplate theory have a disagreement in that Ord contends that the mammoths were preserved as a result of an ice age at around 700 years after the flood, while hydroplate theory contends these animals were rapidly buried within just a few hours after the flood began, and thus were buried as a result of the flood, not at the result of an ice age. Very special conditions, according to hydroplate theory, would be required to bury and rapidly freeze these mammoths that could only occur at the beginning of the flood. So this means that these mammoths were mammoths that were living pre-flood, if Ord is correct, the mammoths that would have been found in Siberia would have to be descendants from the mammoths that would have been preserved on the ark after the end of the flood. Remember that 2 of every kind were brought to the ark in order to preserve them before the flood began. So mammoths, or could be possibly elephant kind that developed into mammoths, 2 of them would have been preserved on the ark. Therefore, after, they would have had to repopulate. This means there should be evidence of around 10 million of them being in Siberia that would have all had to come from the pair of mammoths or elephant kind that were preserved on the ark. So recall earlier that Genesis 7:22 and 23 says that every living creature with the breath of life died as a result of the flood. So according to Ord's theory, the mammoths found frozen would have had to descend from those 2 that were preserved on the ark. And of course, Genesis 8:4 records that on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. So what this means is that these that survived would have had to begin to repopulate after the end of the flood, and animals did, in order to repopulate the earth. But they would have had to then also migrate from Ararat to Siberia and Canada and Alaska over the coming centuries. It is doubtful that mammoths and their young migrated 4,500 miles from the mountains of Ararat to Siberia during the Ice Age and increased their numbers to 10 million, all in just 700 years. Now, between Ararat and what's now Siberia is pretty harsh country, too. It's pretty harsh topography in that. So, but to repopulate to 5 to 10 million, all in just 700 years, seems a little incredible too. So using some basic population statistic formulas and doing some math, if you start with 2 mammoths after the flood, with an annual growth rate of about 2.23%, it calculates to just over 10 million total population after 700 years. And this assumes that all of our mammoths migrate exactly the same direction towards Siberia. I don't think that necessarily would be the case. They wouldn't all head in one direction, I wouldn't think. Of course, we don't have any way to know these things, but speculation, that seems to make some sense. So if we consider the current elephant growth rate, it's only around 0.16% per year. We might be able to assume that mammoth growth rates might be fairly similar. And at a rate of 0.16% per year, of course, you would have considerably fewer than 10 million after 700 years. And again, that would assume they're all headed basically in the same direction. I would assume that conditions after the flood might favor higher annual percentage growth rates than that. Again, there's kind of no way to know. But other factors that we need to factor into this is that a female elephant has to reach the age of at least 10 to 15 years in order to be able to even have a baby elephant. So the pair that came off the ark could have had a baby fairly quick. They would have had to have a second baby, a male and a female, in order to start again. And those 2 would have had to reach the age of at least 15 years or so before, 10 to 15 years before they could start to populate. So again, a lot of things that kind of don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Let's see, it just seems like this is difficult to explain. And again, why would they head towards Siberia? Where have such large animals that did not need to migrate ever increased their numbers by that much and that quickly, even in a favorable environment? Also, why would they migrate towards such harsh conditions? Extrapolating population growth rates appealing to geometric progressions overlooks the requirements for the abundant food, the liquid water, the temperate habitats they must have needed. Again, I think this story has some interesting aspects, and that it does address this mystery from a biblical standpoint, but it doesn't really seem to stand up to much in the way of scrutiny here. And before we go any further with this, I think we can say that Ord's theory doesn't really stand up, but since Ord's theory contends that mammoths and other animals were preserved as an occurrence of the Ice Age, I think it'd be a good time to take a little side detour and discuss what an ice age is based on the various theories of what ice ages are. and what causes ice ages, along with discussing when an ice age or ice ages might have occurred in the past. And again, realize according to Orr, the mammoths were frozen during an ice age. Hydroplate theory disagrees with that and says that they were buried as a result of the flood, and the not buried as a result of an ice age. And this is a very important difference to note here. This is a subject, again, I wanted to discuss, so I think this seems like a good time to do that. As we begin to address these questions, we must realize that the origin of the ice age or ages is a subject of controversy within earth sciences. Michael Ord on his website does correctly state the following. He says, the cause of the ice age or ages has been and continues to be a major mystery for secular earth scientists. They have well over 60 theories. Although theories abound, no one really knows what causes ice ages. And so I think first we should look at what standard mainstream science has to say about ice ages or the ice age. And the way some scientists talk, one would get the idea that an ice age can occur easily. However, many secular scientists have admitted that the cause of an ice age is unknown. And as we just heard, there's well more than 60 different theories regarding ice ages. So standard evolutionary theory, of course, is based on the assumption that Earth is of a very old age, and it's generally accepted today in evolutionary circles to be 4.6 billion years or so old. And estimates on the age are based on various dating methods, primarily radiometric dating, in which they date meteorites that have struck the Earth. And there are several types of radiometric dating methods used today. However, there's no possible way to verify any of these methods are actually accurate. And if these different methods are performed on the same sample, the tests by these various methods don't agree with each other. Sometimes they can yield extremely varying results, sometimes hundreds of millions of years different from each other. So if these different methods on the same samples yield such varying results, how could you start to have any degree of faith or credibility that these are correct? It's not really the scope of the class today to dive deeper into this subject, but it would kind of seriously sidetrack us from what we're talking about here. But realize there's much evidence and reason to conclude that meteors were not formed in outer space from some planet that exploded. We discussed this earlier. Or that they failed to form when some expelled rocks and debris from some planet that exploded occurred. But we see there's much evidence that the Earth actually was a consequence of these meteors being expelled into outer space when the fountains of the Great Deep burst forth. And this would have been about 5,000 to 10,000 years, 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. So that's what we'll have to end up this week, and we'll continue that in our next class. Thank you.